Welcome to today's Explainer, everyone. Today, we're diving straight into the Pyu Millennium. Now, you might be wondering, who exactly were the Pyu? Well, they were literally the very first urban civilization of the Irrawaddy Valley. These fascinating people laid the permanent bedrock for modern Myanmar, yet their story somehow often flies right under the radar. Together, we're going to uncover a civilization that completely transformed a landscape, built massive walled cities, and pioneered religious traditions that are still alive today. Let's get started. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap to unpack a pretty dense, 1,000-year historical record. First up, the dawn of the Pyu. Then, masters of water and brick. In Part 3, we'll examine the Buddhist vanguard. Next, we'll see how they became a hub of ancient trade, and finally, we'll take an objective look at their fall to Bagan.
Section 1. Dawn of the Pyu. So, to really get a handle on who they were, we have to trace a monumental migration. We're talking about Tibeto-Burman-speaking people moving down from the Yunnan Plateau straight into the central dry zone of Myanmar. And they didn't just set up camp randomly. No, they were incredibly strategic. Take a look at early settlements like Halin in the north, Baiktano in the middle, and Sri Sektra down towards the south. They positioned themselves absolutely perfectly to manage the river tributaries and lock down vital overland routes.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because their epic is honestly astonishing. We are talking about a run of roughly 1,000 years. They enter the Irrawaddy Valley around the 2nd century BCE, and by the 1st century CE, boom, they firmly founded major walled cities like Halin. Fast forward to the 7th and 8th centuries, and that southern city of Sri Sektra supersedes Halin in both size and influence. And finally, by the 11th century, the Pyu are fully absorbed into the Pagan or Bagan kingdom. Just a massively successful run.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the Pyu were viewed by the people around them. Ancient Chinese chronicles actually describe them beautifully, noting they were a gentle, Buddhist people who shaved their heads, wore cotton garments, and settled disputes through negotiation rather than violence. I mean, think about that. It paints a picture of a remarkably civilized, diplomatic culture thriving in an era that was usually defined by brutal conquests.
Part 2. Masters of water and brick. Okay, so the Pyu didn't just somehow survive in the arid central dry zone, they completely engineered it. Check out this finger-marked Pyu brick. This tangible piece of history is a real game changer because it marks a definitive shift in Southeast Asia from building with temporary timber to using permanent brick. We aren't just looking at a building block, we are literally looking at the foundation of a lasting urban society.
Let's walk through their ingenious four-step brick-making process. First, mix clay, sand, and, this is crucial, rice husks. Then soak it. Second, knead it thoroughly. Third, press it into a wooden mold. And fourth, apply those distinctive finger marks. Adding rice husks was an absolutely brilliant move. It gave the bricks incredible structural integrity during the firing process, which is exactly why we're still finding them completely intact over 1,000 years later.
And this brilliantly illustrates their ultimate survival secret: sophisticated engineering. They mastered a seasonally scarce water supply by building fortified walled cities, elevated irrigation weirs to divert river water, complex water tanks for the dry season, and massive central palace citadels. They didn't fight their harsh environment, right? They completely hacked it through locally adapted mastery.
Chapter 3. The Buddhist vanguard. Look, we literally cannot overstate the religious impact of the Pyu. They created the very first historically documented Buddhist urban civilization in all of Southeast Asia. And the key concept to understand here is syncretism. They weren't rigid about a single faith. Instead, they seamlessly blended Theravada Buddhism with Hinduism, specifically Vishnu worship, and local spirit worship, or animism. A perfect example is the Pyu city of Baiktano. The name translates to City of Vishnu, yet the place was packed with Buddhist monastic structures. Just a highly inclusive, vibrant spiritual life.
So the crucial point is that the Pyu didn't just practice Buddhism, they actively preserved it. Look at this massive discovery from the Hin Ba relic chamber at Sri Sektra, the oldest Pali text in the world. They safeguarded some of Buddhism's earliest surviving scriptures, meticulously carving them right onto precious gold and silver treasures. Incredible dedication.
But to record these texts and actually run their cities, they needed a written language. So they took the Indian Brahmi script and adapted it. But here is the real intellectual triumph. Because their specific Tibeto-Burman language was tonal, they actually invented tonal markers to make the script work for them. Mostly used for religious and administrative purposes, it left behind a completely fascinating record for us today.
Section 4. Hub of Ancient Trade.
You know, it's so easy to picture ancient civilizations living in these isolated little bubbles. But the Pyu? No way. They were highly connected global players with a booming, dynamic economy. Thanks to their incredibly strategic geography, they sat right on the overland trade routes connecting the giant economic markets of China and India. Every single caravan and merchant passing through just added to the vast wealth of the Pyu city-states.
Their trade network was seriously extensive. They exported agricultural surplus, which, remember, was only possible because of those genius irrigation systems. They traded iron, terracotta, and semi-precious stones. But notice those silver coins. Historical records actually suggest the Pyu's use of silver coinage might be the oldest in all of Southeast Asia, turning their cities into wealthy, bustling, cosmopolitan hubs.
Which brings us to part 5, the fall to Bagan.
Well, all empires eventually hit a wall, and the fall of the Pyu wasn't just one bad day. It was a complex triple threat. First, in the 9th century, severe environmental shifts started altering the river patterns their agriculture relied on. Then, in 832 CE, they suffered devastating military invasions from the Nanzhao kingdom to the north. Finally, in 849 CE, the incoming Barmar people established a fortified garrison at Bagan. The Pyu were basically stressed environmentally, militarily, and demographically all at the exact same time.
Let's look at this comparison side by side. You can clearly see how the famous Bagan Empire was basically a massive evolutionary step standing squarely on Pyu shoulders. The Pyu built early Buddhist stupas. Bagan expanded that into over 10,000 pagodas. Pyu syncretic deities evolved into Bagan's institutionalized Theravada Buddhism. And those Pyu monastic beginnings, they directly paved the way for Bagan's massive monastic universities. So ultimately, this is a story of cultural assimilation. The Pyu people didn't just vanish into thin air. Sure, their distinct language faded out by the late 12th century, but the people themselves, their bloodlines, those brilliant irrigation techniques, and their profound Buddhist faith, it was all completely absorbed into the Bamar ethnicity and the Pagan Empire. They became the living bedrock of what followed.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to chew on. How many modern civilizations are unknowingly standing upon the unrecognized foundations of forgotten ancestors? The Pyu Millennium shaped the religion, the agriculture, and the architecture of Southeast Asia, and those echoes are still being felt right up to the modern day. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the foundations of the history you know.